I sent my wife and children away to protect them from the war. It was the hardest decision I had ever made, entrusting their safety to a distant country while I stayed behind to safeguard our home. I thought I was sacrificing everything for their future. But what I didn't realize was that I was sending them into the arms of betrayal. And when I uncovered the truth, I didn't just confront it. I made her regret it in ways she'll never forget. Elena and I had a good marriage, or so I thought. We weren't perfect, but we had weathered the storms that came with nearly 15 years together. There was love in the quiet moments. The way she would hum to herself while washing dishes. The notes she'd leave in my coat pocket when I had a tough day at work. She'd always tell me that I worked too hard, but I did it for her. For us. Our 2 children, Ivan and Sophia, were the heart of our little family. Ivan, with his curious mind and quiet confidence, always felt older than his 12 years. And Sophia? Well, Sophia was a firecracker, constantly running around the house, her laughter filling every corner. She had just turned 8, and every time I looked at her, I saw Elena's spark in her eyes. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. A home filled with warmth, laughter, and arguments over the small stuff. Like whose turn it was to take out the trash or whether Sophia could stay up late to watch cartoons. I thought we were happy. Elena was my partner in everything. When we first married, we had nothing but each other. We'd rented a tiny apartment, saved every penny, and built our lives from the ground up. She was with me through every promotion, every setback, every long night where I worked overtime to make sure we could give the kids more than we ever had growing up. And in return, I gave her all of me. Every ounce of love, trust, and devotion I had. She said I drank too much sometimes, and she wasn't wrong. I'd have one too many beers after a bad day, maybe raise my voice more than I should. But it never lasted long. The next morning, I'd always apologize, and she'd smile and say, "Just don't let it happen again." I never hit her. I never even considered it. She said she loved me despite my flaws, and I believed her. But things had changed over the past few years. Little things. The way she'd pull back when I reached for her hand. The way her laugh didn't sound as genuine when we were together. I chalked it up to the stress of raising 2 kids and balancing everything that life threw at us. Marriage wasn't easy, but I thought we were strong enough to weather anything. When the war broke out, I clung to that belief. It started with rumors, distant sounds of unrest that felt too far away to worry about. But the cracks widened quickly. One day, we were celebrating Sophia's 8th birthday, laughing as she smeared frosting on her face. The next, we were crouched in the kitchen, shielding her from the windows as sirens blared outside. The world we built was falling apart, and my only thought was to protect them. I told Elena we needed to get them out, get her and the kids to safety, to somewhere the war couldn't reach. I'd follow soon, I promised, as soon as I secured what little we had left. Elena cried the night before they left. She wrapped her arms around me and sobbed into my chest, whispering over and over, "I don't want to leave you. Please, don't make me go." "You have to," I told her, my voice firm even though my heart ached. "You need to keep the kids safe. That's all that matters." "I'll wait for you," she said, looking up at me with tear-streaked cheeks. "No matter how long it takes, I'll wait. You're my everything. Don't forget that." I kissed her, trying to believe that her words were enough to hold us together. The next morning, I stood on the train platform as they left. Ivan waved at me through the window, trying to be brave, while Sophia cried in Elena's lap. Elena pressed her hand against the glass, mouthing the words, "I love you." I smiled and waved, even though my throat felt tight and my chest felt hollow. When the train disappeared into the horizon, I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty tracks and wondering when I'd see them again. She called often in the beginning. Her voice over the phone was my only lifeline. She'd tell me about their new life, how the kids were adjusting, how she'd found a part-time job, how much she missed me. "I love you," she'd say at the end of every call. "I can't wait for us to be together again." Her words were comforting, but something about her tone felt different. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, she was in a foreign country, raising 2 kids on her own. Of course she was stressed. Of course she sounded tired. At the time, I believed her. But the truth has a way of creeping in, doesn't it? I didn't realize it then, but that train had carried more than my family away. It had taken the life we'd built together, too. And war wasn't the only thing that had torn us apart. Months passed, and with them, the steady rhythm of my conversations with Elena began to falter. At first, she'd call every night. Her voice would light up as she described Ivan's new school, Sophia's latest drawings, or how she had found a cozy cafe down the street where she could read while the kids played. But those calls began to dwindle. Every other day became once a week. The warmth in her voice cooled, replaced by a clipped efficiency, as if she were ticking off an obligation. "I'm busy," she'd say when I asked why we didn't talk as often. "It's hard balancing everything here." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe that it was just the stress of starting over in a foreign country. But even the children sounded different. Ivan, once so eager to tell me about his day, now gave short, vague answers. Sophia, who had never been able to keep a secret, avoided my questions entirely, her small voice barely above a whisper. And then there was my mother. She wasn't one to overstep, but she was fiercely protective of our family. She called me one evening, her tone sharp with suspicion. "They're hiding something," she said without preamble. "Elena doesn't speak to me the way she used to. She's distant. And the children, they're not themselves." I asked Ivan about school, and he changed the subject like I'd asked him something inappropriate. I sighed, trying to sound patient. "Mama, they're adjusting. It's not easy being in a new country, with new people and new routines. Elena is probably just tired, and the kids are still settling in." My mother didn't buy it. "I've known that woman for 15 years. I know when something is wrong. And mark my words, something is wrong." I tried to brush off her concerns, but they lingered in my mind like a thorn I couldn't quite pull out. Deep down, I knew my mother wasn't one to imagine things. She was sharp, her instincts honed by years of navigating life's complexities. 2 weeks later, she made up her mind. "I'm going to visit them," she announced over the phone. "I'll stay for a week or 2, just to make sure they're all right." At first, I protested. "Mama, you don't need to go. It's a long trip, and I'm sure they're fine." But she cut me off. "You don't see what I see, and you're too far away to know what's really going on. If I'm wrong, I'll come home and eat my words. But if I'm right," she trailed off, letting the weight of her words settle between us. I didn't argue further. Perhaps I was relieved, grateful she could check on the family while I stayed behind. Perhaps I was afraid to admit, even to myself, that her suspicions mirrored my own. The day she left, she called me from the airport. "I'll keep you updated," she promised. "And no matter what I find, remember, you deserve the truth." I didn't know it then, but that truth was already waiting for her, buried under layers of lies and deceit, ready to be uncovered. My mother had always been a keen observer, the kind of woman who could pick up on the faintest shift in mood or behavior. She didn't need long to notice that something was off. When she arrived at Elena's apartment, it was the small things that struck her first. The expensive dresses hanging in the wardrobe, the designer perfume on the dresser, things Elena could never have afforded on her modest part-time salary. Elena's explanations were vague, her tone defensive. "I got them on sale," she'd said with a quick laugh, brushing it off. But my mother wasn't fooled. Then there were the absences. Elena had always been a homebody, happiest when she was with the children, cooking or helping Ivan with his homework. But now, she was constantly going out, claiming to be meeting friends or attending work events. My mother would sit in the living room, pretending to read a book, and wait for Elena to return. Sometimes it was hours later, and Elena's excuses always felt rehearsed. The children were another clue. Sophia, so young and unfiltered, let a comment slip during breakfast. "Mommy's new friend is funny," she said, her little voice bright with innocent excitement. My mother froze, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "New friend," she asked carefully. Ivan shot his sister a sharp look, his face pale. She means one of Mommy's co-workers, he said quickly, his voice strained. That's all. Sophia's mouth opened to protest, but Ivan gave her a warning nudge under the table. My mother didn't push further, but the damage was done. She spent the rest of her visit observing, piecing together the puzzle in silence. The tension in the household was palpable, a current running beneath every interaction. The children avoided direct answers. Elena avoided my mother's gaze, and the apartment felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. When my mother returned home, she wasted no time. She sat me down at the kitchen table, her expression a mix of sadness and resolve. You need to see this for yourself, she said, her voice low but firm. Something is going on, and it's not good. Elena's hiding something, and the children know it. They're scared, Alex. I can see it in their eyes. I tried to remain calm, but her words hit me like a hammer. Are you sure? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She nodded. I'm sure, but you don't have to take my word for it. Go there. See it with your own eyes. I hesitated, the thought of confronting whatever truth awaited me filling me with dread. But my mother wasn't finished. I'll pay for your ticket, she said, sliding an envelope across the table. You need to do this. When I opened the envelope, I realized where the money had come from. It was Elena's. My mother had used funds from her account to pay for the trip. The irony was almost unbearable. My wife had unknowingly financed the moment her lies would unravel. With a heavy heart, I agreed. I'll go, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. As I packed my bag that night, a strange mix of emotions churned inside me. Anger, fear, and the faintest sliver of hope that my mother might be wrong. But deep down, I knew the truth was waiting for me. All I had to do was step into the unknown and face it. I arrived in their new country at dawn, the first rays of light painting the city in a soft, golden hue. The streets were eerily quiet, the stillness amplifying the sound of my footsteps as I walked toward the small apartment we'd rented for them. My heart pounded with a mix of anticipation and relief. After months apart, I was finally going to surprise Elena and the kids. In my mind, I had played out this moment countless times. I pictured their faces lighting up with joy, Sophia running into my arms, Ivan grinning that shy grin of his, Elena's tears of happiness as she hugged me tight. I told myself this was what our family needed. A moment to reconnect, to remind ourselves of what we meant to each other. But as I reached the door and inserted the key, a strange sense of unease washed over me. It was nothing I could pinpoint, just a feeling that something wasn't right. I shook it off and stepped inside. The apartment was silent, too silent for a home with two children. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if it carried the weight of secrets I wasn't ready to uncover. I set down my bag and walked toward the children's bedroom. Their door was ajar, and when I peeked inside, I saw them sitting on their beds, wide awake. Ivan's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously between me and Sophia. She clutched her blanket tightly, her small hands trembling. "Papa," I said, smiling as I opened my arms to them. "I'm home." But they didn't move. They didn't run to me, didn't shout my name the way I had imagined. Instead, they stayed frozen, their expressions filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Guilt? What's wrong? I asked, my voice faltering. Ivan's gaze flicked toward the hallway behind me, and Sophia whispered something under her breath. It was so faint I couldn't hear, but the way Ivan hushed her, his voice sharp with panic, sent a chill down my spine. I turned toward the master bedroom, the door closed but not entirely shut. That's when I heard it, a man's voice, low, muffled, but unmistakable. For a moment, I stood there, my mind refusing to process what I just heard. It had to be a mistake. Maybe it was a neighbor or the TV or something, anything but what my gut was screaming at me. I didn't think. I acted. I strode down the hallway, my footsteps heavy, my hands trembling as I pushed open the door. And there she was, Elena, my wife of 15 years, lying in bed with a man I didn't recognize. They both froze, their faces turning toward me in unison. Elena's hair was disheveled, her bare shoulder peeking out from beneath the covers. The man, young, confident, and completely unbothered, grabbed his shirt from the floor but made no effort to leave. I stood there, staring, unable to move. It felt like time had slowed, like the air had been sucked out of the room. The woman I had loved, trusted, and sacrificed for was lying in our bed with a stranger. Elena opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and shame. "Alex," she finally whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't wait to hear the rest. The red haze of rage was already descending, blinding me to everything but the betrayal before me. Behind me, I could hear the children stirring, their footsteps timid as they crept toward the hallway. They had known. That much was clear now. They had known and they hadn't told me. But at that moment, I didn't care about the explanations or the lies. I cared only about the image burned into my mind, the image of my wife and the man who had taken everything from me. The man fumbled to dress, his movements frantic yet unapologetic. He muttered something, an apology, perhaps, or an excuse, but the words were meaningless noise. I didn't look at him, couldn't look at him. My eyes stayed fixed on Elena, who sat frozen on the bed, clutching the sheet to her chest like it could somehow shield her from what she had done. "Alex, I can explain," she began, her voice trembling. The words spilled out in a jumbled rush, desperate and incoherent. But I wasn't listening. I turned slowly toward the hallway, where Ivan and Sophia stood huddled together. They didn't meet my eyes. Ivan's hands were balled into fists at his sides, his face streaked with silent tears. Sophia, clutching his arm, looked so small, so fragile. Her lip quivered as she buried her face against her brother's shoulder. And that's when it hit me. They knew. "You knew," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The weight of those two words felt heavier than any shout or scream. Ivan's shoulders sagged as a sob broke free from his chest. "Papa, he stammered, but he couldn't finish. Sophia clung to him tighter, her tiny hands gripping his arm like a lifeline. Her face peeked out for a moment, her big, tear-filled eyes meeting mine before she quickly looked away. They didn't deny it. My own children had known. They had seen their mother bring another man into our home, and they had said nothing. The betrayal cut deeper than I could bear. Elena's infidelity was one thing, but this was something else. The very foundation of my life, my family, had crumbled beneath me. Elena began crying then, her voice breaking as she tried to reach out to me. "Alex, please. It's not what it looks like. I didn't mean for this to happen. You have to understand." But I couldn't hear her. I didn't want to hear her. The sight of her, the sound of her voice, the thought of everything I had done to keep her safe. It was too much. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sobbing on the bed. I passed my children without a word, their whispered apologies chasing me down the hallway like ghosts. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't even slam the door as I left. I walked down the street in a daze, the morning air cold and biting against my skin. I found a small motel a few blocks away, handed over some cash for a room, and locked myself inside. There, in the dim, suffocating silence of that motel room, the full weight of what had happened finally crashed over me. My mind replayed the scene over and over. Elena's wide, tear-filled eyes, the stranger's smug indifference, the children's haunted faces. Each memory was a fresh wound, cutting deeper into my already fractured heart. I drank that night, not out of habit but out of necessity. I needed to drown the rage, the sadness, the betrayal that churned inside me like a storm. But no matter how much I drank, the pain didn't go away. By the time the sun rose, the haze of alcohol had given way to a new clarity. Revenge wasn't a choice. It was an inevitability. Elena's infidelity was a betrayal of our marriage, but the deeper wound was what she had done to our family. She had involved our children in her deceit, forced them to carry the weight of her lies, and left them broken in the process. I couldn't let her walk away from that unscathed. But my revenge wouldn't be violent. It wouldn't involve screaming or throwing punches or draining her bank account. That wasn't enough. No, I wanted her to feel what I felt. To know what it was like to lose everything she held dear. To watch her life crumble in front of her, piece by piece, until she was left with nothing but regret. And so I began to plan. The first step was simple: the children. They were the heart of everything. The reason I had stayed strong through the war, the anchor that had kept me tethered to my purpose. I knew they weren't to blame for Elena's betrayal. They were victims caught in the web of lies she had spun. But they had been complicit, too, and that was something I couldn't ignore. So I spent the next few days focusing on them, pouring every ounce of my attention and affection into them. I didn't yell, didn't question their silence from before. Instead, I became the father they needed, the safe harbor they had been missing in the chaos of their mother's deceit. I told them stories about the war zone I had stayed behind to protect, painting vivid pictures of the risks I had taken to keep our family home intact. I reminded them of the sacrifices I had made, of the long nights I spent worrying about them, of the countless hours I had worked to ensure they could live comfortably in their new country. Sophia, young and impressionable, responded quickly. Her bright eyes filled with guilt every time I mentioned the things I had endured. "I didn't know, Papa," she whispered one night as I tucked her into bed. "I didn't know you were going through all that." Ivan, older and more guarded, took longer. But eventually even he began to open up. One evening, as we sat on the couch, I gently brought up the man I had found in their mother's bed. "What's he like?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Sophia looked down at her lap, fiddling with the hem of her shirt. "He's mean," she said quietly. "He yells at us when Mommy's not around." Ivan nodded, his jaw tight. "He doesn't care about us. He only cares about her." Hearing those words was like a knife to the chest. My anger burned hotter, but I kept it hidden. "You don't deserve that," I told them. "You deserve to be loved, to be safe. I'll always make sure of that." Slowly but surely, the seeds I planted began to grow. The children started to pull away from Elena, seeking me out for comfort and reassurance. It wasn't manipulation, it was the truth. And they were beginning to see it for themselves. The second step was harder but necessary. I knew that if I was going to make Elena truly feel the weight of her choices, I had to take away the one thing she thought she could rely on, her children. One night, as Ivan and Sophia sat with me at the dining table, I laid out my plan. "Your mother has made her decision," I said gently. "She's chosen someone else. But I'll never leave you. I'll always be here for you. Come with me, and we'll start fresh. Just the three of us." Ivan hesitated, his brows furrowed in thought. "What about Mom?" he asked, his voice uncertain. I met his gaze, my voice steady. "Your mother made her choice. Now it's time for us to make ours." Sophia looked at Ivan, then back at me. "Will we still see her?" she asked, her small voice trembling. I leaned forward, taking her tiny hand in mine. "That will be up to her," I said. "But we deserve better than this, Sophia. We deserve to be happy." When the time came, I didn't give Elena the courtesy of a warning. It was a quiet evening when I put the plan into action. Elena had gone out, no doubt to see the man who had stolen her from me. While she was gone, I packed our things, clothes, toys, school supplies, everything the children would need for a fresh start. Ivan and Sophia helped, their movements quiet but determined. We left the apartment as the sun set, the children clutching their bags as we walked to the car. I felt no regret, no hesitation. This was what had to be done. Elena returned later that night to an empty apartment. No laughter, no toys scattered on the floor, no children waiting for her with questions about their homework. All that remained was a note I had left on the kitchen table. "You chose him. I chose them." I could only imagine the look on her face as she read those words, the panic that must have set in as she realized what she had lost. For the first time, she was truly alone. And that was just the beginning. Elena's lover wasn't just anyone. He was a man of status in their new community. A successful businessman, married with children, and well-connected. He had built his reputation on a carefully crafted image of integrity and family values, a facade that now made him the perfect target for the next step in my plan. I had no shortage of evidence. During the days I spent observing Elena before taking the children, I had documented everything. Photos of her sneaking out late at night, texts she had carelessly left on her phone, even a recording of the confrontation on the morning of my arrival. Every piece of evidence painted a damning picture of their affair. With meticulous precision, I compiled the evidence into a neat, anonymous package. And then I sent it everywhere it would hurt the most. The first recipient was his wife. I made sure the package arrived at her doorstep, addressed to her personally. In it, I included screenshots of messages between him and Elena, photos of their clandestine meetings, and even a timeline of their affair. I left nothing to the imagination. Next, I sent the evidence to his colleagues and business partners. A man so dependent on his reputation wouldn't survive the stain of a scandal, especially one involving another man's wife. Finally, I turned my attention to the parents at the children's school. It wasn't difficult to find a contact list. Elena had kept all their emails in a folder for school updates. I forwarded the evidence to them, ensuring they saw exactly what kind of man was spending time with their children. The scandal spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, whispers had turned into full-blown gossip. His name was on everyone's lips, and no amount of damage control could contain the fallout. Elena wasn't spared either. Her affair had made her an outcast among the very community she had tried to build a new life in. Parents avoided her at school drop-offs. Her so-called friends stopped returning her calls, and even her neighbors refused to meet her gaze. The two of them had built their affair on lies and secrecy, and now those very lies had become their undoing. The fallout was swift and brutal. Elena's lover, unwilling to risk his career and family, abandoned her almost immediately. I imagine the confrontation between them must have been bitter, filled with accusations and regret. But in the end, he did what men like him always do. He chose self-preservation over loyalty. Without him, Elena was left to face the storm alone. Her reputation was in tatters, her friendships dissolved, and her once bright future now overshadowed by the weight of her choices. It wasn't long before she reached out to me. At first, her messages were casual, probing for information about the children, asking if I would be willing to talk. I ignored them, but as the days turned into weeks, her tone grew more desperate. She called at all hours, leaving voicemails that swung wildly between anger and sorrow. "You've taken everything from me," she sobbed in one. "Please, Alex, just let me see my children." I didn't respond. Her emails were even more pitiful. She begged for forgiveness, pleaded for a second chance. She wrote paragraphs about how she had made a mistake, how she still loved me, how she wanted to fix things. But her words were hollow, empty apologies that came far too late. For every message she sent, I felt nothing but satisfaction. She had gambled everything. Our marriage, our family, our trust, and lost. Now, she was reaping the consequences of her choices, and I had no intention of saving her from them. Elena was alone, ostracized, and left with nothing but the ruins of the life she had tried to build with another man. And I was just getting started. Weeks after I had destroyed her lover's life and taken the children back to our homeland, Elena appeared at my doorstep. I didn't expect her. She looked disheveled, nothing like the confident, composed woman I once knew. She stood there trembling, clutching her coat tightly, her eyes hollow but desperate. She begged to be let inside, claiming she had no one else, that she'd made a terrible mistake. Against my better judgment, I let her in. As she stepped into the home she had abandoned, her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor. She wept uncontrollably, clutching at my hands as if I were her last hope. "Please," she said between sobs. "I'll do anything. Just let me come back to the family. We can forget everything. You don't have to tell anyone about what happened. I'll make it right. I'll make it perfect. Just don't leave me like this." Her tears fell freely, pooling on the floor as she knelt in front of me. She looked up, her face pale and streaked with makeup, desperation etched into every line. Anything you want, anything at all. Just come back to me. For a moment, I simply stared at her. The love I once felt for her seemed like a distant memory, eclipsed by the image of her in bed with another man and the lies she forced our children to keep. Her betrayal had carved a hole so deep that no apology could fill it. But then an idea began to form. If she wanted forgiveness, if she truly wanted to come back, she would have to suffer as I had suffered. Not just in tears and regret, but in her very soul. I reached down and lifted her chin, forcing her to meet my gaze. "You'll do anything?" I asked, my voice calm but cold, the weight of her answer pressing down on the room. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Anything." I leaned closer, so close she could feel the heat of my breath. And then I said the words that would make her blood run cold. "Then earn it. Show me how much you regret what you did. Beg." She looked up at me, her face contorted in confusion and fear. I already am," she stammered. I shook my head slowly. "Not like this." What happened next was not planned. It came from somewhere deep inside me, a raw and visceral need to see her stripped of every ounce of pride she had clung to. I made her kneel at my feet and confess every detail of her affair, every lie, every betrayal. At first, she hesitated, her voice breaking as she tried to shield herself from the shame. But I demanded more. "Say it," I commanded, my voice like steel. "Say what you did, who you did it with, and why you thought I wasn't enough for you." Her tears fell harder, and she began to tremble. But she did as I asked, her voice trembling as she recounted the nights she spent with her lover, the lies she told our children to cover her tracks, and the moments she justified it all in her mind. "You think this is over?" I said when she finally fell silent. "You think I'll take you back just because you're crying now?"
No, Elena.
"You haven't even begun to understand what it feels like to lose everything." She sobbed, her body shaking as she clung to my legs. "Please stop," she pleaded. "I can't take it anymore. Have mercy." But mercy was a luxury I could no longer afford. I didn't stop until the sun began to rise, casting a harsh light on her tear-streaked face and hollowed eyes. By then, she was a shadow of the woman she had once been, broken and begging for mercy. But I wasn't finished yet. "You want forgiveness?" I asked, my voice low and unyielding. "Then you'll tell your parents, your friends, and the entire family the truth. You'll tell them how you betrayed me, how you lied to your children, and how you destroyed everything we built together. And if you try to twist the story, if you so much as omit a single detail, I'll make sure the world knows every dirty secret." She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "Please, don't do this. I'll do anything, but don't make me humiliate myself like that." I leaned down, my voice barely above a whisper. "You humiliated me. Now it's your turn." True to my word, I forced her to confront everyone she had lied to. One by one, she told her parents, her siblings, and even her closest friends about her affair. She stood before them, a broken woman, her voice shaking as she confessed to everything. By the end, she had nothing left. Not her dignity, not her pride, not even the illusion of the life she once had. She begged me to stop, kneeling in front of me, pleading for mercy. But mercy? Mercy was for the faithful, not for someone who had destroyed a family. And when it was over, I walked away, leaving her alone to pick up the pieces of a life she had shattered with her own hands.